Hi there, hope you're having a pleasant day wherever you may be. I'm about to check out some places that a lot of them Paul Revere went to. I'm about to walk the Freedom Trail in Boston, Massachusetts. The Freedom Trail is a 2.5 mile long trail along the city streets of Boston that loosely follow a lot of the sites from around the Revolutionary War period. There are a few here and there that don't necessarily pertain to that, and actually on this little walking tour, I'm going to kind of skip over there. I think I'm just going to stick mostly with the American Revolution with a couple of exceptions. Now, contrary to what you may think, the Freedom Trail is actually not that old. It was conceived in 1951, I believe, and it was a hit. You know, tourists flock to it. It goes to a lot of cool places. Most of them free. There are a handful that are not. Walking along the Freedom Trail, it's pretty easy to find. You just follow this red brick line in this sidewalk that goes the entire length. Really easy to follow. Now, the Freedom Trail starts here in Boston Common, which is essentially just a large park. However, it was established in 1634, making it the oldest public park in the country. Over the years, it had various uses, including like military training and things like that, before eventually it was used just as a park, which is what it is now. It's also here at the Visitor Center here in Boston Common that you can start Freedom Trail tours led by people dressed in colonial era clothing. And they'll walk and point out all the sights and things like that. So it's kind of neat to see these hordes of tourists following someone dressed up like a town crier or something. It's pretty cool. So the first stop, which is basically adjacent to the Common, is the Massachusetts State House. And you can almost refer to it as the new one, even though it was built in 1798. It's where the governor works and the state capital of Massachusetts. And since it was built in 1798, it obviously didn't have a role in the American Revolution, but it's the first stop and figured it was worth mentioning. So now I'm at the Old Canary burial ground. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's an old burial ground here. It has the likes of Benjamin Franklin's parents, John Hancock. I had a woman named Mother Goose who dubiously is claimed to be the Mother Goose. Well, actually, her headstone's not here, but she's buried here somewhere. But probably the reason most people know about this burial ground is because of Paul Revere. Paul Revere is buried here. And judging from the number of bars that he's been claimed to visit here in Boston, he probably died of alcoholism. So next is the King's Chapel, which the only thing I found interesting about was that the original congregation were loyalists. So during the American Revolution, they bailed to Canada. A new congregation came in that was much more sympathetic to the American cause. But what's interesting is that the King's Chapel burial ground, that's the oldest in the city. Now, I don't really recognize anybody that's buried there, but the fact that it's the oldest, that's pretty cool. So this is the Old South Meeting House, instrumental in the Revolution. This is where the Boston Tea Party planned their stuff. And it was a church. Ben Franklin was baptized here. So it's kind of interesting. A little bit of trivia. So now this is the Old State House. This was built in 1712, I believe. It's one of the oldest buildings in Boston. It was the seat of government for Britain during the colonies, and then once this is also there was some sort of ruling that didn't go in the colonists' favor, and they said that was the genesis of the American Revolution. Following that, it became a place of government for Boston and Massachusetts in post-war. And they also say that shortly after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, that balcony was one of the first places that it was read aloud to the public. Most people were able to hear it. So it's one of the oldest buildings in the city. It was the government seat for a really long time here, even in the U.S. Post-colonial era. But interestingly enough, now it's also a tea stop. How many buildings built in the 1700s can claim to be a subway stop? Pretty cool. It was also here that in 1770 the Boston Massacre took place. British fired upon the crowd, killed 5 people, and was part of the problems that led to the ultimate American Revolution. But yeah, it took place right here. There's a little circle plaque thing on the ground that's really easy to miss if you didn't know what you were looking for. So here is Faneuil Hall? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I can't pronounce anything in this town. Yeah, it was a marketplace on the ground floor, had a lot of shops and things like that. The second floor has the Great Hall, which is where a lot of meetings took place between a lot of the big names of the American Revolution. You notice a pattern here. A lot of this was meeting places, a lot of places where plans were made. So this was another one of those integral parts where people met to discuss kicking out the king. As you can see, there's some construction going on, so maybe I can dig up a picture that I took a couple years ago of what it looked like without the balloon. So here's a stretch just leaving the Faneuil Hall area that goes next to some really old bars and things. A lot of them claim to be the oldest in the city and things like that, like Bell in Hand, which was started by an old town crier, Green Dragon, which is said to have been there forever, and the Old Oyster House, which is the oldest restaurant in the city. Now, some of them have moved locations over the years, but those are their claims to fame. Cool little stretch here, even though it's not officially part of the Freedom Trail. So here is Paul Revere's house on the Freedom Trail. It was built in the 1600s. Paul Revere's family owned it during the 1700s, around the time of the Revolutionary War. But judging from the amount of bars in town that claim that Paul Revere visited them, how much time did he actually spend here? He was probably more in the pub. But yeah, it's one of the pay sites. They don't allow pictures in there, but it's pretty much just you're walking around an old house. It's kind of cool, but just an old house, really, is all it is. So this is the Old North Church, made famous by Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. It's the one if by land, two if by sea church. So they hung up 2 lanterns in the steeple there to alert the neighboring Lexington and Concord of how the British were going to approach on their attack. Now, it's a pay site. It's one of the pay sites on the Freedom Trail, but I think the last time I was here, it was free, so I could show a couple of pictures of what it looks like on the inside. It's essentially just a church, but its role is definitely elevated, if not by the facts, the colloquialism of the great story of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride. Now, just a few blocks off the Freedom Trail is the Wine Tavern. Now, earlier I made a point to point out the different bars and taverns in that little cluster that all made different claims of being the oldest, but those at some point have all changed locations, whereas the Wine Tavern, that one's in the original location. So when George Washington, Paul Revere, when they came to get a drink here, it's the same location. So that makes it my favorite because it really does have the history to go behind it. So the Wine Tavern. Next is the USS Constitution at the Charleston Navy Shipyards. Now, these are technically not relics of the American Revolution or colonial period. These actually came just after. After America won its independence, it realized, hey, we're going to need a navy if we want to play this game. So that's where this area came to be, and USS Constitution was one of the first 6 ships commissioned for the young United States Navy. As far as the actual shipyard, I just read it was used up until the 70s to maintain naval ships and things like that. So a little modern history too. And lastly, you end up at the Bunker Hill Monument, which is dedicated to the Battle of Bunker Hill, which took place in July of 1775. Now, what's interesting about this battle is that it was the colonists versus the much better British Army, and ultimately the colonists lost. Yeah, this is not a victory here, at least not in the traditional sense. The colonists were outmatched, yet they managed to go toe-to-toe with the best army in the world at the time. And it is even said that if they didn't run out of ammunition, they could have actually beaten the British here, but they did. It went into hand-to-hand combat, and ultimately the colonists had to retreat. Even though they lost, it was very significant in a couple of ways. One is that the British Army sustained a lot of damage. They lost a lot of men, and they used up a lot of ammunition. They just took a lot of damage. Secondly, this was sort of a continuing to unify, as I believe one said, it stoked the flames of liberty, you know, kind of thing. So it was just a good morale booster. Even though they lost, they put up a good fight, and just that kind of, they rode that wave into the revolution. Now, speaking of the monument, it was built, or they started building it in the early 1800s because they called this pretty much sacred ground pretty much after the battle. So they needed to put something here to commemorate. And ordinarily you can climb to the top, but it's closed today. So there's also a little museum across the street worth checking out. Gives you a little background on not just the battles, but the neighborhood and things like that. Well, that does it for this one. Thanks for joining me on this little walk around Boston on the Freedom Trail. I know I didn't hit up all of the sites. I skipped over some, especially the ones that didn't directly relate to the American Revolution. I just kind of did the ones that I thought were interesting. And with that said, I hope you had a good time, and I guess I'll see you on the next one. And interestingly enough, right across the street, again, not Revolution related, but really cool, is the statue commemorating Robert Gould Shaw, who led the Massachusetts 54th in the Civil War, which was known as the All Black Regiment, featured in the movie Glory, one of my all-time favorite movies. And the end credits, they show the monument, so pretty cool. This is where it's at.